You work on this boat." Blake Mercer laughed loud enough for the three investors behind him to hear it. Beside him stood Audrey Gavin Whitaker's ex-wife, studying her former husband's plain shirt, with something close to pity. Blake pressed an empty champagne glass into Gavin's hand. "Then go get me another one. At least you found work after 15 years. Gavin had not answered when the captain crossed the deck toward them. "Mr. Whitaker, the route you approved has been confirmed." Blake's smile went out. Who was this man really? 15 years before that morning, on the Aurelia, Gavin Whitaker spent most of his working life in the engine spaces of boats that belonged to other men. He was a marine engineer who had drifted into operations management for a charter company in Miami, and he was very good at both halves of the job. He could read a maintenance log the way other people read a face. He knew when a generator was 2 months from failing, which fuel supplier was quietly overcharging, and why an asset worth $11 million was losing money every quarter it sat in the water. The company's owner once handed him a spreadsheet for a vessel bleeding cash and asked him to explain it. Gavin did not look at the spreadsheet. He asked for the maintenance log and the charter calendar, instead laid them side by side on the desk, and after 20 minutes, he pointed at a stretch of empty weeks in August. The boat had been pulled out of service for a repair that took 4 days and a parts order that took 19. The repair was not the problem. Nobody had rebooked the weeks around it. That was how his mind worked, and it never occurred to him that anyone should be impressed by it. He drove a used truck. He maintained himself. He wore plain shirts because they were comfortable, and because the engine room did not care. He had never once told a stranger what he earned, and when people at parties asked what he did, he said he worked on boats and left it there. Audrey Whitaker lived in a different Miami. She planned luxury events, anniversary dinners, on private islands. Product launches, where the flower budget alone ran past $40,000, and she was excellent at it. But the job put her inside rooms. She could not afford to stand in on her own, night after night watching women. Her own age step out of cars she would never own. She never said she wanted those things. She simply began to notice with increasing precision everything she did not have. She started measuring their life against those rooms in small ways. The truck, the apartment, the vacations. Gavin planned around boatyard schedules instead of seasons. He would come home with grease still under his fingernails and talk about a hull survey. He had caught an error and genuinely pleased, and she would find herself thinking that the man across the table had reached the top of whatever he was climbing and had not noticed the summit was low. Blake Mercer walked into her professional life during a launch party she was running on Brickell. I was one of those men who arrive at an event already talking. Within 10 minutes, she knew about a penthouse, a season in Monaco, and a deal in the low tens of millions that he described as nearly closed. Within a month, she knew that almost none of it could be verified, and by then it did not matter, because Blake had given her something Gavin never had. He made the future sound loud. The night she asked for the divorce, Gavin had come home late from a delivery run and was still washing his hands at the kitchen sink when she started. She had rehearsed it. He listened without turning around the water running, and when she got to the end of it, she said the sentence he would remember for 15 years. "I can't spend my whole life waiting for you to become someone important." Gavin shut off the water. He dried his hands, folded the towel, and set it on the counter. He did not tell her she was wrong about him. He did not promise she would regret it, or ask her to wait, or point out that in 11 years she had never once asked what he actually did for the company that paid him. Whatever he felt stayed where he kept everything. "All right," he said. He signed the papers. 11 days later, in an office with bad lighting, shook the attorney's hand and drove back to the marina, because there was a scheduled sea trial that afternoon, and the crew was waiting on him. He worked the trial. He filled out the report. He went home to an apartment that was suddenly too quiet, slept badly for a long time, and told exactly no one about any of it. What stayed with him was not the sentence. It was the assumption underneath it that a man's ceiling could be read off his truck and his shirt, and that his own wife had read his and found it low. The question came to him 3 months later, standing in the engine room of a vessel whose owner had never set foot in it. He was signing off on a fuel efficiency change he had designed himself, one that would put roughly $90,000 a year back into somebody else's pocket. And the thought arrived fully formed and would not leave. If he was good enough to make other men's assets profitable, why was he still making them profitable for other men? The answer was that it was safer not to. He knew exactly what he had, which was savings. A reputation among crews and no cushion at all. He spent 5 weeks looking at numbers before he found the boat. She was a 140-foot charter yacht called the Sandpiper, 18 years old, moored in Fort Lauderdale, and she had lost money for 6 consecutive quarters. The broker handling the stake was a man named Dale Foster, who had been trying to move it for 11 months and had stopped pretending otherwise. "I'll be honest with you," Dale said, sliding the folder across. "2 people have looked at this. Both walked. The last one called it a hole with teak on it." Gavin read the file for 40 minutes without speaking. Then he asked for something the folder did not contain. The maintenance history, the fuel receipts, and the booking calendar for the previous 3 years. Dale had to make 2 phone calls to get them. When they came, Gavin spread them across the table in the same order he always did. The boat had spent 109 days of the previous year sitting idle in a slip. Not in a yacht, not under repair. Idle between charters, because nobody was coordinating the calendar with the maintenance windows. She was burning money on fuel contracts, negotiated by a manager who had never renegotiated anything. And she was running a crew rotation that guaranteed overtime in exactly the weeks she earned least. "You want it?" Dale asked, and there was something close to laughter in it. Gavin put nearly everything he had into the stake. His accountant called him twice to talk him out of it, and then a third time to put the objection in writing. Dale told a colleague afterward that the buyer was an engineer who had confused knowing how a boat worked with knowing how a business did. They were all making the same mistake. They were looking at the vessel. Gavin was looking at how it was run. He did not spend money on the Sandpiper. He spent attention. He replaced 2 suppliers inside the first month and put the fuel contract out to competitive bid for the first time in the boat's life. He rebuilt the maintenance schedule around the charter calendar instead of the other way around, so that yard time landed in the dead weeks and never in the paying ones. He cut the idle days from 109 to 31. He reduced overhead everywhere he found it soft. He did not touch the safety standards. Not once, not in any line item, not in the 2 months when the numbers were bad enough that his accountant stopped returning his calls out of what he later admitted was embarrassment. Every survey happened on schedule. Every replacement part was specification or better. When a first mate flagged a fire suppression issue that would cost $11,000 and 4 days of a booked week, Gavin canceled the charter and refunded the client himself. In the spring of the 3rd year, the Sandpiper turned a profit. It was a number on a page positive for the first time, and Gavin looked at it for a while, and then went back to work. But it proved the thing he needed proved, which was that the principle scaled. A well-run asset made money. A badly run one did not. Everything after that was the same work repeated at increasing size. The second yacht came 14 months later, bought the same way, undervalued, mismanaged, structurally sound. The third came from an owner who had heard what happened to the first two and called him directly. Then a marina in the Florida Keys that had been operating at half occupancy under a man who had never audited his own slip pricing. Then berths in the Caribbean because the boats needed them, and buying was cheaper than renting. Then a maritime services division because the yards he depended on kept disappointing him, and eventually it was simpler to build his own. I did all of it quietly. There was no launch party, no profile in a business magazine, no yacht named after himself. The assets sat under a set of holding companies structured for tax and liability reasons that had the incidental effect of making the ownership almost impossible to trace from outside. Beyond his senior management team, very few people knew how much of it belonged to one man. 15 years after he signed the divorce papers, that man stood behind Whitaker Maritime Group, and the flagship of the fleet was a super yacht called the Aurelia. On a Saturday morning in early June, Gavin drove himself to the terminal and walked up the passerella of the Aurelia unannounced. He did this 4 or 5 times a year, always without warning, because an operation you only inspect on schedule is an operation that only performs on schedule. He carried a folder of technical reports, and the deckhand, who saw him first, straightened up and said, "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker." Warren Hale met him on the bridge. Warren had run boats for 31 years and had captained the Aurelia since her delivery, and the two men had a working relationship built entirely out of things. Neither of them had to say twice. They went through the pre-charter items in under an hour, a routing decision for the 4-day trip, which Gavin approved. A generator hour count Warren wanted logged early, a section of non-skid on the aft deck that Gavin marked to be replaced at the next yard period. "I'm writing this one out," Gavin said. "She's just off a yard period, and I want the stabilizers and the port generator under real load before I sign the acceptance." Warren said that was fine and made a note of the extra cabin. Gavin had seen the charter manifest. He had not read the guest names carefully because guest names belonged to Marissa Kent and never had been his. Marissa ran guest services on the Aurelia with a level of precision Gavin considered the single most underrated asset in the company. If the names had mattered, she would have told him. So he was standing on the aft deck at 10:40 in the morning, folder under his arm, when Audrey stepped aboard. She saw him before he had finished processing that it was her. 15 years had been generous to her. She was dressed for the boat rather than for the dock, which meant she had spent money on the trip, and she stopped walking when she recognized him. Blake came up the passerelle behind her, already talking, already gesturing at the sightlines, with the proprietary air of a man showing off something he had rented. Behind Blake came 3 people who were plainly not friends. Nolan Briggs, heavy and watchful, said almost nothing. Diane Weller carried a leather folio she did not open. The third was silver-haired and quiet, and when the second engineer passed with a clipboard, that man stopped him and asked a short question about the vessel's maintenance interval, then listened carefully to the whole answer. His name was Preston Shaw, and Blake had been chasing his money for 7 months. Gavin understood the shape of the weekend within about 90 seconds. Blake had chartered the Aurelia 4 days, all of it, aimed at closing something in the range of hundreds of millions of dollars, because he needed a stage that made him look like a man who already had it. The boat was the argument. Everything else was decoration. Blake did not know who owned her. What Blake saw was a man in work clothes holding a folder of paperwork standing near the service side of the deck, and he recognized that man's face from photographs Audrey had never quite gotten around to throwing out. He turned to the investors with real delight, as though something wonderful had been handed to him. "You have got to be kidding me. Audrey, tell me that isn't him." Blake was already laughing. "This is Audrey's ex-husband. 15 years ago, This man was fixing engines for a living, and she waited around for him to turn into somebody. He crossed the deck, took the empty champagne glass from the rail beside him, and pressed it into Gavin's hand. "You work on this boat. Then go get me another one. At least you found work." Diane Weller looked at the deck. Nolan Briggs looked away. Preston Shaw did not look away at all. He watched Blake with an expression of complete neutrality that would have frightened Blake badly if Blake had been the kind of man who noticed such things. Audrey said nothing. She looked at the folder and the worn shirt, and what crossed her face was not cruelty. It was pity, which was worse. Gavin held the glass. He did not correct him. He had spent 15 years learning that the urge to explain yourself is almost always the weakest thing in the room, and that a man who is wrong about you is usually in the middle of telling you exactly who he is. Warren Hale came down from the bridge at that moment with the routing confirmation in his hand, and he came down the way he always did, without any awareness that he was walking into anything. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "the route you approved has been confirmed. We're ready to get underway." The laughter stopped. Blake looked at the captain, then at the folder, and something in his face began to reorganize itself. "I'm sorry," Blake said. "What exactly does he do on this vessel?" Warren looked at him for a moment, as though the question did not entirely parse. Then he answered it plainly, because it was a plain fact, and he had never been asked to treat it as anything else. "Mr. Whitaker owns the Aurelia." The deck went silent. Not awkward silent. The airless silence of 5 people recalculating at the same time. Audrey's hand had come part way to her mouth and stopped there. The empty champagne glass was still sitting in Gavin's palm, and every person present was now looking at it. Blake Mercer had just publicly humiliated the owner of the yacht he was using to prove he mattered. Gavin could have ended it in a sentence. The charter agreement gave him grounds the crew would have executed it without a question, and Blake would have walked back down that passerelle in front of the 3 people whose money he needed. For 2 full seconds, standing there with the glass in his hand, Gavin considered it seriously. Then he set the glass down on the rail and turned to his captain. "Run it by the book," he said. "Same as always." Warren nodded once and went back to the bridge. 20 minutes later, the lines came off and the Aurelia moved out of the terminal into open water, with everyone still aboard. Blake spent the first 4 hours at sea rebuilding himself. He changed clothes twice. He told a long story at lunch about a deal in Lisbon that nobody had asked about, and he laughed harder than the story deserved. Humiliation of that specific kind does not make a man like Blake quieter. It makes him louder, and it makes him determined to be seen winning something before the day is over. Everything he needed was already installed on the observation deck. He had spent 5 weeks building the presentation. A low stage, a screen, an audio-visual rig, and a lighting design that would come up as the sun dropped. The centerpiece was not the slides. It was a coordinate. Blake had paid a consultant to calculate a position and a heading, so that at 8 minutes past 7 in the evening, the Miami skyline would rise behind his shoulder exactly as he reached the part about scale. Marissa Kent found the first problem at 2 that afternoon. She was walking the observation deck with the event brief when she stopped at the aft section of the staging and checked the deck plan against what was bolted down in front of her. Then she checked it again, went below for the certified load documentation, and came back with it. Part of the rig sat outside the certified load area. Not by much, and not because anyone had been careless. The vendor had built to a drawing that assumed the boat's deck ratings matched a sister vessel's, and they did not. Marissa flagged it and sent it to the bridge, which was exactly what she had been trained to do. Warren had a second problem by then. A weather system had been building since morning. The models had firmed up over lunch, and the track ran directly across the water, where Blake's coordinates sat. It was not a storm that would sink anybody. It was a system that would put weather on an exposed observation deck at the same hour a rented crowd was supposed to be standing on it. Warren declined the heading change and had Marissa deliver both findings together in person because he did not believe in sending bad news through an intermediary. Blake came up to the bridge deck 11 minutes later with his color high. "I chartered this vessel," he said. "I decide where it goes." Warren answered without any edge in it at all, which was somehow worse. "You chartered the vessel's services. You didn't charter command of her." Marissa stepped into the space between them, with a tablet and 2 alternatives. She had spent the last hour building. The first kept the presentation on the observation deck exactly where it was. Same audience, same timing. With the rig repositioned inside the certified load area and the skyline, entering at a slightly different angle. The second used a different waypoint safely outside the weather, with a sight line she had checked personally against the original consultant's renderings. The difference was small enough that she doubted anyone but Blake would ever notice. Either option would carry the presentation. She said so plainly, and she said it twice. Blake turned down both. "You don't understand what this is," he told her. "I didn't spend 5 weeks on this to stand up in front of Preston Shaw and deliver an approximation." That was the sentence Preston Shaw heard. He was on the deck below with a coffee in the shade, entirely visible to anyone who bothered to look down. And he heard most of the exchange because it was conducted at volume on an open deck. He did not take a side. He did not go up. He watched Blake for a while, then turned his chair slightly and went back to his coffee. Audrey heard it too from the passageway. She had known Blake a long time and had watched him be charming, be expansive, be relentless. She had not before watched him shout at a 60-year-old captain about a weather system, and something in her went very still. By the next morning, Blake had constructed an explanation he could live with, and it was not that his own consultant had drawn the rig wrong. It was that Gavin Whitaker was using the rule book of his own vessel to take something back. He said it at breakfast loudly, with all 3 investors present. Those rules, Blake explained, were written for ordinary charter guests, for people renting a boat for a birthday. This trip involved a transaction worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and there was a point at which a serious operator made a judgment call. He wanted to speak to whoever had the authority to make one. The trouble with the demand was that everyone at the table already knew the answer. The man with that authority was the man. Blake had handed an empty glass to the previous morning, and going to him now meant crossing the deck to ask a favor of someone he had mocked in front of the exact people he was trying to impress. So Blake decided to go around the entire system instead. The Aurelia took on fuel that afternoon at a facility south of Miami, a stop that had been on the schedule for 3 weeks. It required about 90 minutes alongside, and Blake had made 2 phone calls the night before. At 2:30, an audio-visual crew of 4 arrived at the dock with Case's credentials from a company nobody aboard had contracted and instructions to install the rig to the original drawing. They got as far as the passerelle. The bosun stopped them. The second mate confirmed no vendor was scheduled, and the crew was held at the dock while Warren came down from the bridge. Warren spent 9 minutes establishing 3 facts. The vendor had been engaged directly by the charter guest. The installation would have placed load outside the certified area, and the guest had been told in writing by the service manager the previous afternoon that this configuration was not permitted. He wrote the incident report himself in longhand first, because that was how he thought, and issued Blake a formal written warning. Then he made the call. The charter agreement gave him and made it in a single paragraph, citing the operational conduct clause, by number. All special event operations for the remainder of the charter were suspended. Not the trip, not the meals, the cabins, the tenders, or the service. The stage, the screen, the lighting, the rig, and every element of the presentation Blake had spent 5 weeks building came off the schedule, and a deck crew was already breaking the staging down before Blake finished reading the warning. He read it twice on the aft deck with his hand shaking slightly. Dinner still happened that evening. The Aurelia's chef put out 5 courses in the main saloon. The service was flawless, and the table was set for 5 under warm light, with the water going dark outside the windows. There was no stage. There was no screen. There was no lighting cue and no calculated skyline, because the boat was 31 nautical miles from the coordinate Blake had paid a consultant to find. Blake talked his way through the first course. He was good at it, better than the room gave him credit for, and for a while, it almost worked. Then Preston Shaw set down his water glass. "Blake," he said, "tell me about how you manage risk." Blake started answering. He talked about diversification and downside exposure and a hedge structure he had used in a previous venture, and he was perhaps 40 seconds into it when he understood that Preston was not asking about a portfolio. Preston had watched a man be offered 2 workable options and refuse both. He had watched him raise his voice at a captain over weather. He had watched him try to move an outside crew aboard during a fuel stop. None of that was a presentation problem, and Preston Shaw had not become who he was by mistaking one kind of problem for another. He was asking what Blake did when money could not make people move. The story had quietly turned over at that table, and nobody announced it. Gavin was no longer required to prove anything. He had been proving it for 15 years, in maintenance logs and fuel contracts and canceled charters, and the proof did not need an audience. Blake, meanwhile, had begun the work of demonstrating thoroughly publicly and entirely on his own initiative that he was not a man anyone should hand hundreds of millions of dollars to. Blake found Gavin at the stern later that night, after the investors had gone below. The arrogance was gone. That was the first thing Gavin noticed, and it did not please him the way people assume such things. Please a man in his position. Blake stood at the rail with his hands on it and took a long time to start. "My business is in trouble," he said finally. "Not the version I've been selling upstairs. The real version. Preston's money doesn't accelerate anything. It decides whether there's a company in 18 months. He looked over. "That's the truth, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't repeat it." Gavin said he wouldn't. "Then call your captain. That's all. One phone call. Tell him to lift the suspension, and let me put the stage back up tomorrow night. You have that authority. You own the boat." "I own the boat," Gavin said. "Warren is the captain. Once she's off the dock, safety decisions are his. That's a technicality. It's the only reason anyone can trust anything this company says." Blake's voice climbed. "You're doing this because of Audrey." Gavin turned and looked at him for the first time in the conversation. "If a complete stranger had done what you did today, the outcome would be identical. That's the entire point of running it the same way." Blake left without answering. His footsteps went forward along the side deck and stopped somewhere near the bow. Audrey came out about 20 minutes later. She stood a little way off before she spoke, looking at the deck, the tender garage, the lit windows above them, the whole scale of the thing, which she had spent 2 days revising her understanding of. 15 years, she said, and nobody knows. Some people know. That isn't what I mean. She came closer to the rail. I thought I knew what I was looking at, Gavin. The truck, the shirts. You'd come home talking about a fuel contract, like it was a good day, and I thought I was watching a man who had stopped climbing. It never once occurred to me that you were building the thing you would climb." Gavin did not help her out of it. He had never been cruel, but he had also stopped years ago doing the work of making other people comfortable about their own conclusions. "Blake needs this deal," she said. "I know how that sounds coming from me, but he does. Is there any way at all, not by breaking the rules that keep this vessel safe?" Audrey nodded slowly, and to her credit, she did not argue. Some part of her had wanted him to say exactly that, and she recognized it as she went below. Blake did not accept it. He had one asset left, and he understood it clearly. He could not move Gavin Whitaker on the Aurelia. But Gavin Whitaker had spent 15 years building something that was not made of boats at all, and it was made of the willingness of serious people to believe that Whitaker Maritime did what it said it did. He called his attorney at 11:40 that night, and then his communications people. He was not worried about Preston, who he assumed would hear the money version of events long before anyone put a technical file in front of him. Men like Preston Shaw did not read incident reports. That was what Blake believed, and it was the most expensive thing he believed. By morning, a story was moving through the charter and investment networks along the Florida coast. The owner of Whitaker Maritime Group had used his position to sabotage a client's deal because of a personal grievance involving his ex-wife and the man she was now with. Seen from outside, it was almost impossible to disbelieve. Audrey was Gavin's ex-wife, a matter of public record. Blake was with Audrey. Blake had chartered Gavin's yacht without knowing who owned it. Blake had insulted Gavin publicly on the first morning in front of witnesses. And within a day of that, every element of Blake's presentation had been shut down by the vessel's crew. The sequence was true. Every item in it had happened. That was what made it work. Blake had video too. Someone in his party had been filming the arrival the way people film arrivals, and the footage caught the whole first exchange, Blake laughing the empty glass. Changing hands, Audrey's face, and Warren Hale walking into frame to say that Master Whitaker owned the Aurelia. What the clip did not include was everything that followed the certified load area. The weather routing. The two alternatives. The 4 technicians stopped at a fuel dock. Cut where Blake cut it. It read as one thing only. A rich man had been embarrassed on his own boat, and a rich man had made somebody pay. It moved fast, and it moved, while the Aurelia was still at sea. Gavin took the first call at 7:20 in the morning from a strategic partner in the marina business, who did not bother with pleasantries, and asked him directly what had happened aboard. A high-end charter client with 2 bookings on the fall calendar put both on hold pending clarification, which was a polite way of saying something else. Then the real one landed. The marina expansion deal. Whitaker Maritime had been working for 9 months. The largest single acquisition in the company's history came off the closing calendar. Not canceled. Suspended pending resolution of the allegations, which in that business can mean 6 weeks or can mean forever. For the first time in 15 years, Gavin Whitaker was losing something that actually belonged to him. Blake came to him at midday with the offer, and he did not bother to dress it up. One call. "Tell Hale to restore the presentation for tonight. I'll withdraw everything before we're alongside my attorney." Sends 1 letter. My people put out 1 statement. The whole thing was a misunderstanding between a client and a crew. Your client comes back. Your partner stops asking questions. Your marina deal is back on the calendar by Friday. He let that sit. "I don't want to do this to you, Gavin. I want the deal I came for." It was an entirely real offer. Blake could deliver every piece of it, and the arithmetic was not close. 1 phone call against a client. A reputation and 9 months of work. The only cost was that he would have to instruct a captain to reverse a safety decision that had been correct in every particular for money. He stood there long enough to feel the actual weight of it. He thought about the number on the Marina file and about the people in his company who had spent 9 months on it, and he understood with unpleasant clarity that if he made that call, then every time Whitaker Maritime told a client that the rules did not bend, it would be a sales line. The rules had held for 15 years because they had never once cost him anything he could not afford. This was the first bill. Warren had come down and was standing near the door with the incident file waiting, not saying anything. Gavin looked at him. "Nothing changes," he said. "Your decision stands." Blake was gone from the deck within a minute. Gavin called his legal team that afternoon and told them to assemble the complete record of the charter, every document, every timestamp, every written communication in order. He did not authorize a counterstatement. He did not call the 2 people he knew who could have made trouble for Blake by Tuesday, and both names had gone through his head. The last message came in at 11 that night. The Marina deal was still off the calendar. The charter client had not come back, and his partner would not commit to whether a file of documents would be enough to repair anything at all. Gavin had chosen the principal. For the first time, he did not know whether choosing it would be enough to save what he had spent 15 years building. The file went out at 8 the next morning to every party that had asked a question, and several that had not. It was not a defense. Gavin's legal team had assembled it exactly as he asked, which was chronologically with nothing characterized and nothing argued. Blake's requested heading change with the timestamp of the request. The weather modeling for that coordinate pulled from the same service the bridge had used. The certified load documentation for the observation deck with the vendor's drawing beside it and the discrepancy marked. Marissa Kent's 2 written alternatives, both preserving the presentation. Blake's refusal of both. Warren Hale's formal written warning. The engagement record of the outside audiovisual company, and the timestamps proving Blake had hired them after Warren declined. The last item ended the argument. The suspension had not come from an owner. It had come from a captain under his own authority and under a numbered clause of the charter agreement, and the man who owned the vessel had been standing on the aft deck at the time, with no idea it was happening. The audiovisual company confirmed the rest without being pressed. Blake had engaged them directly, told them to install to the original drawing, and instructed them not to route the request through the crew. The truth did not fix anything that morning. That was the part nobody warns you about. The charter client's 2 fall bookings stayed on hold. The Marina expansion stayed off the calendar. Gavin's partner in that deal read the file acknowledged receipt and wrote back that they would need time to evaluate. Time in that sentence was not a courtesy. It was a man protecting himself in case the story turned out to have a second half. The Aurelia turned for Miami at 9:40 and ran a long, quiet passage home. Blake stayed in his cabin. The investors read on the shaded deck. Gavin worked through the technical reports he had come aboard for, in the first place logging stabilizer performance and generator hours, because there was nothing else to do, and because the alternative was standing at a rail doing arithmetic he had already done. I did not call Preston Shaw. The number was available to him. Marissa had the guest contact and would have handed it over without a question, and he understood exactly what one phone call could accomplish. He could put the file in front of the only person aboard whose opinion could still move money, and he could do it before Blake had a chance to frame it. I did not do it, and the reason was not nobility. It was that the moment he started managing what Preston Shaw believed, he became a man, managing what people believed, and that was Blake's entire profession. He released nothing about Blake's business either, though by then his legal team had learned enough to make the release devastating. He let the documents and the conduct stand on their own, and he spent most of that afternoon aware that this might not be enough. Preston asked for the incident report himself at 4 through Marissa. He read it in the shade on the upper deck. He was not checking whether Whitaker Maritime had told the truth. He had been aboard 4 days and already knew most of it. He was checking the sequence against what he had watched with his own eyes. Blake had been given 2 workable options. Blake had refused both. Blake had raised his voice at a captain over a weather system in the open, where anyone could hear it. Blake had secretly hired an outside crew and tried to move them aboard during a fuel stop. And when all of it failed, Blake had gone to the networks with a story that the man who owned the boat had done it to him, out of jealousy. Preston Shaw had spent 30 years learning that the failed presentation is never the thing. Thing was that a man had been shown a hard limit, one he could not by charm or shout past, and every decision he made afterward had been worse than the one before it. That was not a communications problem. That was judgment integrity and risk management in a man asking to be trusted with hundreds of millions of dollars. He asked Marissa one question before he handed it back, whether the 2 alternatives had been drafted after the dispute or during it. She showed him the timestamps. Both had been logged inside the hour before Blake ever raised his voice by a service manager solving a problem rather than building a defense. He closed the folder and handed it back to her without comment. The Aurelia came alongside in Miami at 11:20 the next morning. Gavin still had no idea what Preston had decided and had stopped expecting to be told. Preston came to him first on the aft deck while the crew was still running lines. He did not mention the file. He did not offer sympathy, which Gavin appreciated more than he expected to. He took a card out of his jacket and held it out. If Whitaker Maritime ever wants to diversify its capital, he said, we should talk. Then he walked down the deck past Blake Mercer, who had come up from below and was standing directly in his path, with his mouth already open, and he did not slow down or turn his head. Briggs and Weller went with him. Neither of them looked back either. Blake was left standing alone on a deck he had rented for 5 weeks' worth of preparation and 4 days of use. He found Gavin near the passerelle as the last of the luggage went ashore. Preston's out, he said. So are the other 2. Briggs called it a governance concern. His face had gone hollow, in a way it had not been the morning he pressed an empty glass into Gavin's hand. You destroyed me. I didn't do anything, Blake. It was not a taunt. It was the literal truth. And it was the worst thing anyone had said to Blake Mercer, sir, in his adult life. Gavin had not called Preston Shaw. He had not touched the deal. He had not used a dollar or a contact against him. And he had turned down an offer that would have cost him nothing but the one thing he would not spend. Blake had done every part of it himself, in front of the only audience that mattered simply by being who he was when the world declined to arrange itself around him. He went down the passerelle without saying anything else. Audrey stayed behind on purpose. She waited until the deck was nearly clear, then stood for a while looking at the boat. The varnish, the tender garage, the crew moving through their post-charter routine, with the unhurried competence of people who had done it 400 times. 4 days earlier, she had assumed the man with the folder was staff. Can I ask you something and get an honest answer? Gavin said she could. If I had known 15 years ago that you'd become the man who owns all of this. She gestured, and her hand took in more than the yacht. Would anything have been different? He did not answer quickly, and he did not answer kindly. He gave it real thought, standing there, with the folder still under his arm, because she had asked for something honest, and had waited 15 years to ask it. If the answer is yes, he said, then we were probably right to get divorced. Audrey understood it immediately, and she took it standing up. If what he owned now could have changed what she felt, then the thing she had loved had never actually been him. It had been a projection with his face on it, a man measured by what he might one day be worth. "One more," she said. "You didn't build all of this to prove me wrong, did you?" "No," she nodded. She had known the answer before she asked, and hearing it was still the hardest part of the trip. She said goodbye and went down the passerelle, and there was no reconciliation and no invitation to stay in touch. Gavin did not watch her go. He did not stand at the rail, savoring anything, and he did not think about Blake at all, which was the most accurate measure of where the last 4 days had landed. The calls started an hour later. The charter client had read the file and asked to reinstate both fall bookings, with an apology more gracious than it needed to be. Before 6, his partner on the marina expansion wrote that they were reopening due diligence and would like to reschedule the site walk. Neither message mentioned Blake Mercer. Both mentioned the file. The partner's note said only that the documentation had been unusually complete, and that a company which kept records like that was not a company that improvised a grudge, which was, in the end, the entire argument Gavin had never made out loud. Nothing had been rescued by leverage. No favor had been called in, no relationship spent, no counter-story placed. 15 years of operational records, the maintenance logs, the written alternatives, the time stamps. The numbered clause had simply been allowed to say what happened, and they had been kept well enough to be believed. Gavin found Warren on the bridge, and they started the post-charter walk through the same way they had done it after every charter for 11 years. A door latch on the starboard passageway needed adjustment. It was catching by perhaps a 1/16 of an inch, and Warren had noticed it on the second night. A section of non-skid on the aft deck had worn smooth the same section Gavin had marked before Audrey ever set foot aboard, now moved up the list. The ventilation in the crew mess needed servicing ahead of schedule. The airflow was down, and nobody could say precisely when it had started, which meant it should have been caught sooner. Gavin wrote each item into the report in his own hand. Marissa came up with the guest services debrief and added 2 lines of her own. It took 40 minutes. Warren waited until the last item was down before he said anything about the rest of it. He wanted to know whether the suspension had cost the company money, and he asked it plainly the way he asked about fuel burn. "Some," Gavin said. "Most of it's coming back. And if it hadn't, then it hadn't." Gavin closed the pen into the folder. "You made the call you're paid to make. If the number on the other side of it changes the answer, then there was never a rule. There was just a price." Warren accepted that without comment and went back to the list. These were the things that had built the company. Not a stage, not a lighting cue, not a coordinate calculated to put a skyline behind a man's shoulder at 8 minutes past 7. A latch, a worn strip of non-skid, a ventilation duct. Blake had spent 5 weeks and a great deal of money constructing the appearance of exactly what Gavin had spent 15 years constructing the substance of, and the difference between them had turned out to be visible to a man like Preston Shaw within about 96 hours. Success with a foundation under it looks unremarkable, right up until something leans on it. When the report was closed, Gavin went forward and stood at the bow. The Miami skyline was across the water in the late afternoon towers, going gold on the western faces. It was the same skyline Blake had paid a consultant to position the exact backdrop he had needed to prove that he had arrived calculated to the minute and the degree. To Gavin, it was a city on the other side of some water. He had looked at it 10,000 times from the deck of one boat or another, and it had never once occurred to him that it could be used to say something about him. 15 years earlier, Audrey had looked at a marine engineer who drove a used truck and came home talking about fuel contracts, and she had believed she was looking at the limit of him. 4 days earlier, Blake Mercer had looked at a man in work clothes holding a folder of paperwork on a super yacht, and he had believed he knew precisely where that man belonged. They had made the identical mistake 15 years apart, and neither of them had needed more than a few seconds to make it. They had taken a single moment, held it up, and turned it into a verdict on an entire life. Nothing had been magically restored. The marina expansion had not closed. It had only been put back on the table, and due diligence would take another 2 months and might still find something either party disliked. Preston Shaw had not invested in Whitaker Maritime. He had handed over a business card, and business cards mean a conversation, and nothing more. That mattered because Gavin had not been handed a miracle ending. He had been handed back one thing only, and it was the same thing Blake had tried to take from him, the right to let his work and the record of it prove their own value without a story attached. The Aurelia had 3 more charters on the summer schedule. There were vessels in the Keys and berths in the Caribbean that needed running next week, the same as they had needed running last week. The maintenance list had open items on it, and the open items would still be open in the morning. Warren came forward and said the yard team was standing by for the latch and the non-skid. Gavin closed the folder. "Let's go." I went back to work. He had spent 15 years building something solid enough that when holding the line finally threatened to cost him a client, a reputation, and the largest deal of his career, he still did not have to betray the thing that had made him. The lesson in it is not about yachts. A person's current position is not a verdict on their future. Real success is measured not only by what someone owns, but by which principles they keep at the exact moment abandoning them would pay better. And sometimes the largest victory available is not revenge on the people who looked down on you. It is stepping back and letting every person's own choices decide who they turn out to be.